Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English news channel of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. Again, I'm Professor Junaid, and one of the things that we will now take into consideration is that we have had some very friendly complaints about some of our shows going on for too long, but I think this is a occupational hazard of some of us academics, including I think our guest today, who I'm incredibly privileged to have, does a much better job than I do at these things. But today, again, you know, we have done shows in the past on this incredibly important subject of when the intense pressure was being placed upon Pakistan, in addition to many other Muslim countries, to quote unquote normalize relations with Israel, a highly abnormal and violent state. And so far, so good in terms of that hasn't happened. But of course, we always have to keep our we have to be vigilant about what is being cooked up at the top. In terms of that. So we have done shows on that, but right now we are obviously confronting an incredibly violent situation in Palestine, and what's been going on. People, I think, throughout the world, and I would hope so here in Pakistan. Of course, our viewership for our guests, it's a global viewership, but they've been, I mean, clearly following. It's been the headlines about what's been going on in Jerusalem and how the Israelis are just unashamedly deploying violence and harassment of the Palestinians. And I could find no one better, certainly in Pakistan, but also, I mean, anywhere in the world, than my dear friend and comrade Ammar Ali Jan. Certainly one of the leading, I don't want to embarrass him too much, but certainly one of the leading intellectuals, scholars, activists in this country at the moment, and incredibly influential and incredible. And just, I mean, on a personal note, I mean, the admiration that I have for his commitment to principles of justice and in a very principled manner on all of these issues. To global justice within Pakistan, etc. I think is highly commendable. So, Ammar, I really want to welcome you and thank you for agreeing to come to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Junaid. Glad to be here.
Wonderful, Ammar. Ammar, so as we know that the recent events that in which out of, well, one can say out of the blue, but actually that's not actually correct. If one understands the Zionist project, and at its heart of a settler colonial project, which by its very essence has to displace and ethnically cleanse a population to take it over. But what we have seen right now are very dramatic. I mean, in the sense that the last time that I can remember was simply the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000, when Ariel Sharon, just one individual with a small entourage, entered the Al-Aqsa compound, and that began the Second Intifada. In this case, we have had Israeli military troops enter into the Al-Aqsa compound with Zionist settlers as well. Again, there's a background to where this is coming from in terms of the attempted evictions and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homes in an area of neighborhood of East Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem, of Sheikh Jarrah. And so these are the facts that I think people have been following on the ground. And Ammar, I mean, I will ask you, I mean, to kind of maybe give us some context of all of these events that are constantly coming, right in our faces right now.
Thank you, Junaid. I mean, this is exactly what's going on. This issue is symptomatic of a much larger history of ethnic cleansing that Palestinians have been facing for a very long time now. I mean, the current issue is, of course, the attempts by Israel to take over East Jerusalem, to turn it into a Jewish neighborhood. But the history, as you pointed out, is much, much larger. I mean, if you just look at the map of Palestine, what has happened to Palestine since 1948, after the partition, I mean, the entire country has been erased, wiped out of the map in front of the international community by the support of the champions, so-called champions of human rights and democracy, the US and all other Western powers, by the criminal silence, if not collaboration, of the Arab regimes. And these people, the Palestinians, have not only been wiped off the map, even the memory, the idea of a Palestinian homeland is now being wiped out by turning Jerusalem into a capital, by this right-wing toxic narrative in Israel that West Bank can become part of Israel, can be annexed by Israel, which is also a very, very important thing to remember, that Israel today wants to annex parts of the West Bank, which means that fundamentally the very idea, the very possibility of a Palestinian state will vanish. It won't be geographically possible to have some kind of a viable state. And it's interesting that there is some opposition to this move in Israel. And the opposition is, it couches itself in nationalist terms by saying that our problem with annexation plans is that it doesn't give us enough Palestinian land. And we want to continue with these informal settlements so that we can eventually wipe out all Palestinians from West Bank and from Gaza. And what is happening in the West Bank? This is the worst example of ghettoization and apartheid anywhere around the world. So you have these settlements in these, they're these densely populated Palestinian communities, and then these Israeli Jewish settlements. And these settlements are connected to Israel through an entire infrastructure of flyovers, roads, which Palestinians cannot use. So you really have two worlds that are separated physically, materially by infrastructure. It's the most horrible use of infrastructure to separate human beings. And the living conditions in both these two worlds are completely opposite. You have universities, schools, hospitals in the Israeli settlements, and people are leaving New York. Jews are coming from London and settling there because of the peaceful life, the tranquility of these settlements. Whereas for Palestinians, it means permanent confrontation with militarized violence, with the Israeli forces, with the police, with daily humiliation at checkpoints. If they want to go from one place to another, they will be stopped multiple times. I mean, this is happening. This humiliation is happening to them in their own lands. This is something that most colonial officers all over the world fantasized about throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but they were never able to institutionalize it the way it's been institutionalized in West Bank and for such a long period of time. And I think this latest uprising is a symptom of this impossible position that Palestinians have been put in, the erasure of their dignity, the erasure of their human rights, and they're fighting for life, literally fighting for life, which is why it is resonating with people all over the world.
No, absolutely, Ammar. I mean, there's the points, all of the points that you made, I kind of hit the nail on the head. I think that in the immediate context, it's important to kind of remind our viewers that what is going on in East Jerusalem itself, where Jerusalem was primarily an Arab city itself, the west part was completely taken over by Zionist settlers. And now what they want to do is exactly what you said, is to completely Judaize, eliminate all kind of Muslim, Christian presence, Palestinian presence from Jerusalem, even the Arab East Jerusalem part. And this is the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood from which the Israeli settlers want to evict, take over their homes, not just throw them out, sometimes throwing out the furniture, sometimes even keeping the furniture. But that is exactly as you said, symptomatic of what they want to do to all of East Jerusalem. And what tells you, what gives the most glaring example of that is they're going into the Al-Aqsa compound. I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of this is the end of Ramadan, the last 10 days of Ramadan. Laylat al-Qadr was that, and these troops are going there. But again, the one interesting point that you did make is that the resistance that we also saw during this. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the type of fear that people would normally have of that type of onslaught while worshiping. They're not prepared for some guerrilla warfare. They're worshiping in the Al-Aqsa mosque, and so the way that they showed their resistance in the face of that was also admirable, despite the horrific and tragic type of violence imposed by the Israelis. And the other thing to point out here is that now we're hearing a lot, these statements by Western governments. Okay, they're very concerned about the violence taking place in these areas, etc. But the word condemnation is only used for the Hamas rockets that have been shot into Jerusalem. And again, it's very, very important because I mean that the Western media propaganda is now global propaganda mainly. I mean, this thing circulates everywhere, even within our own media possibly. But Hamas on the first day of this, the second and third day when they started to fire rockets, when they saw that the Israelis are not relenting, the Israeli military from occupying the Al-Aqsa compound, and the settlers are not relenting in evicting the residents of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, then they gave them at 6 p.m. stop, and we will stop our rockets. This is the first time since 2014. We must remember that. People that say that Hamas just all they do is just fire rockets and engage in terror. This is the first time since 2014 that they have done this, and they've said that please stop at this time and we will stop our rockets. And of course, the Israelis have not. And of course, the Israeli response is not to hold back and in terms of what they're doing, but instead pound Gaza as they have done repeatedly. And just now, it figures 28 Palestinians dead, about 9 of them children, and so on. And we can expect more of this. But I think that the larger point that you're making is, yes, this is the manifestation of the Zionist project, when they spoke about the early Zionists of transfer, etc., and ethnic cleansing, etc. It's been happening. It's been happening from the Nakba, the catastrophe from 48 to 67, and it's an ongoing, and from Oslo, the so-called Oslo peace process. We've been seeing this as well. And so, but the one thing that what I'll say, just like a friendly amendment, Ammar, within Israeli society, it has gone so much to the right at this point. I mean, we're not just talking about the Israeli state at this point. And in some ways, Netanyahu, who I mean, has so many corruption charges against him and is trying to make up this government. He is relying on this society that the one thing they can all unify on is kill the Arabs. I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah, basically, on this Palestinian issue. So I mean, if you can speak a little bit more on that,
Yeah, no, I was actually saying the same thing. I was saying the only opposition to annexation is that it's a lot of settlers are saying it's not violent enough, that we actually don't need to annex. So there is no opposition as such. That was my point earlier. The opposition might be limited to a few civil society people, but by and large, Zionism has won, which it would have, because the whole project is premised upon the annihilation of the other. It is scared of difference. It is scared of anything that interrupts its fiction of creating a homogeneous Jewish homeland.
Exactly. And as well as convincing the Jewish population within Israel, at least. Now there's obviously massive divisions within, even Western Jewry on this question of the uncritical support that they gave Israel since '67. We are clearly seeing some shifts taking place outside of Israel. But within Israel, as you said, Zionism has certainly seems like it succeeded in convincing the Jews there that, yes, the response to anti-Semitism, etc., all is Israel, and everyone is against us, and therefore the only way to survive is to ethnically cleanse or kill.
Yeah, and there's a really good book by Jacqueline Rose on Zionism, which I was actually reading recently.
Yeah.
And one very intelligent argument that she makes is how Jews have turned the tragedy that they experienced, the horrible things that happened during the Holocaust, how that has turned into this permanent form of victimhood, which then is displaced onto an Arab setting, where they are perpetually victims of this majoritarian Arab place, which means that they will justify their violence in the name of defense, in the name of protection, in the name of the Holocaust. And in that sense, despite their ostensible hatred for fascism or Nazism, one of the biggest victories of Nazism is that they've turned these victims into people who are mimicking Nazism. Because of this victim complex, because of this absolute inability to accept any difference, because of this refusal to accept other people's histories, other people's rights, and by insisting on creating a homogeneous community, national community, by erasing anyone that interrupts their fiction. And because most of this Zionism is a fiction, both historical and contemporary, the Palestinian people are facing an ethnocide premised upon a complete fantasy. It's simply not possible for the Palestinian people to accept their own erasure to fit into a misguided, historically bankrupt, morally, ethically bankrupt narrative of another people. And this is unfair at every level. And I think today the anti-fascist struggle is really becoming alive in the refusal of the Palestinian people to accept their erasure. Because what is fascism? At the end of the day, it is an attempt to wipe out all differences for a national project that is backed up by a reactionary mindset. And that is Netanyahu, and that is Israeli society today. It is increasingly a fascist society. And there is no other society, in my opinion. I critique societies across the world and here in Pakistan, other places, but it's very difficult to compare anything like Israel, not because the people essentially are problematic, but because of the very materiality of Israel's existence in an Arab land. It will fuel fear. It will fuel paranoia. It will fuel this violence in the name of self-defense, this preemptive violence, this preemptive wiping out, because of the gap between the project, the aspiration of the Zionist state, and the reality of the Arab world. I mean, that is again a British crime. One of the long list of British crimes to kind of facilitate that such a thing. In
the you're referring to the Balfour Declaration,
absolutely,
exactly, of 1917, calling for a homeland for the Jews in Palestine.
And it was ridiculous to begin with, and it's become more and more ridiculous because of the nature of the Zionist project. The way it comes into complete clash with any material reality that it finds itself with, and the only logical conclusion is someone like Netanyahu, when one continues to believe in this project. So the challenge for both the Arabs and to a certain extent Israelis, if they can find humanity within themselves, is to dismantle Zionism, both its materiality and its fictions, ideologically destroy it, because without destroying such an exclusive and murderous ideology, it's pretty much impossible to imagine some kind of a peaceful settlement.
Absolutely, and we can get to this in a second. This idea of again the dominant narratives within mainstream media of clashes, of violence on both sides, etc. All of the nonsense. Do Palestinians have F-16s and all of this armed to the teeth, etc. It's such a joke the way that it's framed and how it's
Yeah.
sold to the world. But there are many interesting points that you just made that I just want to kind of re-emphasize. The the Zionist project, and you began with a very important book, and of course there's another book which makes similar arguments. It was a very popular book for activists and folks in the Palestinian solidarity movement. Of course, it was condemned obviously by the Zionists themselves, but that was Norman Finkelstein's book, the Holocaust Industry,
Industry.
the exploitation of Jewish suffering.
Hmm.
And it was brilliant. I mean, the way he documented how particularly post 67, how they were in the United States principally, but also in the UK and other places, how they were able to mobilize people to understand that, look, we have gone through this, and therefore we're not talking about the right wing, we're talking about liberal intellectuals. Chomsky speaks about this. The foremost supporters of Israel became liberal intellectuals from abroad of the state of Israel, because for one, yes, that the Holocaust, but again, sort of a certain attachment, a very racist kind of attachment to this kind of, okay, this is an oasis of this bastion of democracy and an oasis of goodness and virtue in this backward Arab land. But the other thing is that, and I think you appreciate this fact, is the Zionist movement, and this is what people need to know, that the Zionist movement that is basically the movement for the creation of the state of Israel. Up until 1940, the global Zionist movement had less members than the Socialist Party than the Jews in the
Hmm.
Socialist Party of New York City. So
Yeah.
it was precisely the Zionists, and this is the intense criminality and just of that history of Zionist leadership's collaboration with the most anti-Semitic, uh, including the Nazis, including the Tsar of Russia, etc., to get Jews to come to Israel, when the majority of the Jews
Mhm.
on the planet were not interested in this. Were interested
Absolutely.
in clear anti-racist struggles where they were, along with other people. But it was the Holocaust that then, of course, enabled the Zionist leadership to also collaborate in bringing Jews to Israel. So it's an important point to remember that this is not just a kind of an indigenous desire by Jews all over the world to go to Israel. Not at all. This was
Hmm.
that was the project. And the other thing to realize at this particular point is that that the model that you were talking about in terms of vis-a-vis the Palestinians, it's the ethnic cleansing, transfer, etc. There is we have had, and we've been talking about kind of all of these kind of colonial enterprises, and this one is one of the most vicious and long-running ones, precisely because the backing of the United States, armed to the teeth, as well as the
Hmm.
collaboration of regimes. We'll get to that in a second in the region. But
Hmm.
but the interesting point here is that you've had different settler colonial models. You've had models, say of course, the American one or the Australian one, in which you just wipe out the indigenous population. Uh,
Right.
you have one. Another second model is saying something like South Africa, in which you have a minority, but which is dependent on the
Hmm.
black majority and their labor, and
Absolutely.
sooner or later, that type of system will fall. In Israel, we presented with a different type of settler colonialism, in which now you have roughly like almost half and half, 50-50 Jews and Palestinians. And so now it's just they want to get rid of them. It's just, and that's what they've done in Gaza, in the West Bank, as you say, taking over, and that will then be accompanied by ethnic cleansing, send them to Jordan, send them to Egypt, and so on. So this is something very, very important, I think, also to emphasize. But Ammar, since we are running a little bit out of time, I think it's important, and maybe even linking it back to kind of the shows that we did earlier on the pressures being placed by particularly the United States. I mean, particularly under the Trump administration, but I mean, really, I think this is going to continue until some type of a mass popular pressure in the U.S., which is happening within the Democratic Party from below. It's slowly happening, but I think this will continue. The pressure for, okay, recognize Israel, negotiate with Israel, normalize with Israel. So I think it's connected to that, but I would like some of your thoughts on kind of, the international arena. I mean, I spoke about kind of the responses we can expect from the United States, et cetera, to this, but also in terms of our own regimes. Yeah, when I say our own, I say what I openly call Muslim Zionist regimes, the Arab world, what they're up to, et cetera, the Gulf states, and the type of pressure they're putting on other so-called brotherly nations such as ours. I mean, if you can comment on that a little bit.
Thank you, Jay. This was very useful. This is the information I think that more and more young activists should learn, read about it, listen to shows like yours to learn about these things, because there is a huge propaganda war being led by Zionists all over the world, who would like us to believe that it's basically this small democratic country, Israel, that's fighting dictatorships.
This boy has just lost his cousin.
Often hear. On the other hand,
girl,
I think it's
brother,
what you just said about the
Hussein
world's
Hamad,
response. I think it's very, very
11 years
clear
old,
that more and more people are finally speaking out against Israel. I mean, yesterday I saw a AOC tweet about it,
Yes.
which is a huge break for many left liberals in the US, especially those who make it to Congress.
It's a great point, because normally we have been, I mean, delighted by the very progressive kind of politics they've demonstrated domestically, but on these types of things, they sometimes remain reticent. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, attacking Israel is not only difficult because of the kind of lobbies that are so strong in terms of finance and elections, but even more so, the ideological baggage that opposing Israel carries is massive. We should remember what happened to Jeremy Corbyn in England, the Labour Party leader who was a principled supporter of Palestine, consistently supported the Palestinian struggle for years. And when he won the Labour Party election, he was immediately termed anti-Semitic. He was termed a sympathizer of terrorists, and not by like some marginalized media groups. He was declared a terrorist sympathizer by the mainstream press, by the Tory party, and eventually by the Labour Party itself, which expelled him for anti-Semitism. And this is a man who stood against racism his entire life. And this is the kind of taboo that so many activists have faced over the years. But you should see what Corbyn said today and yesterday. He named and shamed Israel. AOC did the same. And many people around the world are now speaking out. Many Latin American governments called Israeli actions terrorist. Even the UN Secretary General has spoken about.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Latin American countries. I mean, I was in another interview I was doing. I mean, this is the impoverished political responses we are getting. We have countries from South Africa to South America that are either ending diplomatic relations or at least downgrading them, etc. And then we have these regimes in the Gulf that are now finally, what was concealed before is now coming out in the open, and not only normalizing themselves but pressuring others to normalize. So that is the really sad state of affairs. But I do want to highlight that point that you made. That and again, I'll cite Finkelstein again. His book after the second, just festival of slaughter in Gaza that the Israelis did. This time we went too far, and in it, I think he makes some great points. That even when I was growing up in the U.S. and undergrad, etc., it was very, very difficult to have panels and speak about this, etc., without being called a Nazi, etc., every 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But they are losing. They continue to lose that kind of ideological war that the Zionist lobby's main task was to really police the discussion and the parameters of the discussion, particularly in places like the United States. In the UK, it seems like they've won, and in other places, but they are losing it, particularly when we look at many young Jews now who, in past 10, 20 years, the way the Israeli state has kind of cajoled them to come to Israel to enjoy and see how great it is without seeing a single Palestinian face. But now, I mean, it's so naked and flagrant and blatant that there is a significant division, and I think it's very important for our audience to realize that not only within ordinary Jews, that there's now skepticism about the Israeli state, and whether this is something that has anything to do with the great faith tradition of Judaism or not. So not only is that one issue, but the other issue that we should remind our viewers is the best criticisms and scholarly, intellectual, activists, etc., that are coming of what Israel is doing right now are primarily by Jewish authors. I mean, Chomsky, of course, has been there for a long time, has been writing, but whether it's Finkelstein, I have mentioned, I've had them on my show with people like Ilan Pape, who I think is just the finest historian on the question of Palestine and Israel in the world. So, these are Jews who are consistently writing about this, and I think that our viewership should understand that. And the final point that I'll make, and I'll let you have the last word, is that when we talk about Hamas, for example, and of course, I mean, the U.S. compels everyone when the U.S. wants to declare some force a terrorist organization. Of course, all of the countries that are its poodles and puppets, and they have to go along with it. Of course, the Arab regimes are bankrupt, and they also go along with this, and so on. And they can't tolerate any mass movement, whether it's a Muslim, with all their problems, whether it's a Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's Hamas, whether they created these organizations, but when they become too big or a mass movement, then they're a problem, and then they declare them a terrorist organization. But what we have to remember, all the way going back to 2006, because now there's talk about another Palestinian elections under occupation within the Palestinian territories, which has been postponed now. But when it happened in 2006, I went in 2007 on a solidarity mission there, interfaith solidarity mission, and I was staying in a Christian village, Beit Sahur, and it was incredible that the entire village, with a majority Christians, had voted for Hamas. And and even the Muslim Palestinians that had voted, it may have been, but it was not primarily the case that all of a sudden they started reading the Quran more or the Hadith literature more, etc. They may have, some of them may, but it was because the political bankruptcy, I think you will agree with me, of the Palestinian Authority, which of course Edward Said pointed out since the Oslo Accord, that this was a Palestinian Versailles, a Palestinian surrender, and the Palestinian Authority would function essentially as a police force for Israeli security, not for Palestinian security. So, I mean, I will leave it on that, and I'll give you the last word, Ammar.
No, you're absolutely right. It's very important to read the internal challenges that the Palestinian liberation movement has faced over the past 20, 30 years. And it has transformed fundamentally, particularly, as you rightly pointed out, the degeneration of the Palestinian Authority has wiped out the legitimacy of some of the old guard that was leading the movement and gave a lot of sacrifices in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But after the Oslo Accords, fundamentally the Palestinian Authority was seen both as being corrupt and as being too close to the occupying force. And that provided space for other movements to emerge and become popular. And that's true for any national liberation struggle or any struggle. If there's a real impasse, if there's a real contradiction at the heart of any society, any force that will address that contradiction will become popular. And any force that tries to navigate its way around it will get exposed. And even recently, some of your viewers may know that the Palestinian Authority just refused to hold elections that was supposed to happen on the 22nd of May. So the entire opposition, not just Hamas, but also the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Left Group, and other parties, all of them condemned that move by PA, and it was clear that sections of the Palestinian Authority have been collaborating with Israel and the US for a very long time. Although right now all of them have been pushed by Netanyahu in such a position that there's no point in any kind of internal disagreement at this stage. The point is to set up a united front where we let Palestinians debate their internal differences, but we give them unconditional support in their struggle for national liberation. And this then brings me back to the last point about the Muslim world and generally our regimes, many of whom have been pro-Israel. It's clear that the sentiment on the street is overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian. You can meet anybody from almost any ideological background, and they will tell you that their heart beats with the people of Palestine. They stand with the people of Palestine. They inspire us not only because there's, of course, the element of religion is there as well, but also because Palestine reminds people of our own colonial past and our neo-colonial present. And it tells us that it is possible to say no. It is possible to refuse surrender. It is possible to fight back, even if the entire world is against you. And this audacity of hope that actually the Palestinians have shown, this is what I think has told people all over the world that the real art of politics is not to go for the possible, but to believe in the impossible, in the possibility of the impossible that is deemed impossible by those in power. And Palestinians continuously show that the impossible can be possible by refusing their erasure. And a country like Pakistan, historically, while the sentiment has been overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, our governments have participated in the massacre of Palestinians back in the day. I don't know if you remember the Black September. Zia was sent in to help the King of Jordan to kill Palestinians. And then in the 80s, we collaborated in the Afghan Jihad with Israel.
But of course, again, there's the tension between what the governments and the regime do, and then ordinary Pakistanis who have gone.
Ordinary Pakistanis are completely with Palestine.
Arafat's bodyguard was a Pakistani.
There's an entire history of love and support for Palestinians, and recently there were attempts being made in Pakistan, just like attempts were made in UAE and other parts, to normalize relations with Israel. I think it would be a catastrophe. It's not, the point is not to say there aren't problems with Pakistan or with the Arab world or with Latin America. All countries have their problems, but that does not mean that you become more problematic by coming into alliance with the most problematic country in the world. I think this is not the path we need to go down. We need to improve ourselves. We need to be better. We need to be more like Palestinians. We need to show the world a different way of life is possible, a different way of being is possible. We don't need to go down the gutter by trying to be like a state that unleashes horrific forms of violence. If that is our ideal, then I feel sorry for our people, because then our people will have to face that kind of violence by our states. We need to be different. We need to embody the universal lesson of the Palestinian struggle, which is that all human lives, no matter how much they are erased in discourse and physically, they matter. They matter equally. And this lesson is something that Palestine is teaching the world. It's a lesson in equality. It is a new practice of equality that the Palestinians have taught the world in the midst of horrific colonial violence. And if we, I often say that, Palestinians have carried the burden of history on their shoulders. The emancipatory possibilities of history have been embodied by Palestinians for so long. I think now it is upon all of us to prove that we can be Palestinians. I.e., we can also fight for something better, we can believe in something better, and we can achieve something better. And this is the challenge that Palestine gives to everybody, including to their supporters.
Yes, no, absolutely, Ammar. Just your comment earlier about it's not just about what is possible. It's about thinking about what's impossible and or at least thinking that it's impossible, but trying. That is your ideal that you strive for. And this is one thing that I tell my students, that that talk about, well, these are dreams, but I also say that dreams can come true sometimes as well. So. On that note, Ammar, because I know that we have time, I've taken more time than I asked you for, so forgive me for that. But Ammar, it is an incredible treat for us to have had you on this show, and somehow I will do some arm twisting and get you back on at a later stage as well.
I'd love to be back, and I just want to announce that we are hosting a protest tomorrow in solidarity with Palestine in Lahore. And hopefully there will be protests all over the world so that we can amplify the voices of Palestinians. Thank you. Glad to be here. Really enjoyed the show. Thank you, Junaid.
Thank you, Ammar. Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.